Residential in areas where people live next to industrial operations experience a lower average life expectancy by 13 years. This proposal is not housing championship. People deserve better, and marking this for affordable housing is akin to redlining.
Strong words there from Toshiko Hasegawa, president of the Port of Seattle Commission, pushing back against a plan from Seattle City Council President Sarah Nelson to bring housing to the SODO neighborhood near the Port of Seattle. What is the future of this contentious plan after the city agreed not to put housing in this area just 2 years ago? Plus, what's getting in the way of opening Victor Steinbrook Park, which certainly looks like it's ready to go after several years of being shut down? And what priorities is Seattle's new police chief bringing to the table? We're discussing this and so much more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel, and the views expressed here are mine. I'm joined once again by my co-host, David Croman. David, I saw you posted about some choppy weather on your way into work on the state ferry system there with all this wind we've been having this week. Was your seasickness level feeling a little green, or were you throwing up into Puget Sound? What was going on, man?
Yeah, I get seasick fairly easily, and this was as choppy of a ride as I've ever taken, because I take the Kitsap boats, which are smaller than the big boats, so they really get rocked on days like yesterday. Today was a much smoother ride, fortunately.
Okay, good to hear. Good to hear. Keep that stomach in gear, my man. Great to be with you once again. Thank you so much, David. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. Find them on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks always to our show patrons. Always like to see more of you jump on board, and we're hoping to hear from more of you this week. We're here to answer our questions, answer your questions, I should say, about local politics on the show. So patrons, please do drop us a line. Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Spell it out at gmail.com. That's one bonus of supporting the show. Also, there's some Patrons First content you have access to. And when you become a paid patron on Patreon, you even get this awesome decal. Wow, how cool is that? Finally, a big thanks to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's do this thing. Time for Right Here, Right Now. We begin with a story that we touched on a few weeks ago, a proposal from Council President Nelson to bring workforce housing into the SODO neighborhood around the stadiums. This is specifically in a place where the Port of Seattle made an agreement with the city about 2 years ago that there would not be housing. So Port of Seattle officials are trying to protect their freight routes. They thought the deal was good for a decade, some have said in meetings this week. Council President Nelson, at the last meeting on this issue in January, put together a panel that was supportive of her plan. She got some heat over that from some of her council colleagues for having an, quote, unbalanced approach to this, so she brought in some opponents, and boy, did they let her have it. The Port of Seattle, the Northwest Seaport Alliance, all with scathing remarks for Nelson. And David, before we get into the battles between council members over this issue, I just wanted to ask, do you think Council President Nelson's effort to face her detractors on her proposal, is that going to help her pass this legislation?
Judging by their posture, no, they didn't seem like they had become friendlier to the proposal just because they got the invite to the council chambers. Yeah, I mean, this bill has really run into some pretty intense pushback. Part of that has to do with the fact that it seems like a lot of this sort of, quote, stakeholder work or sort of outreach stuff a lot of times happens before these bills are introduced. And
right.
I think for a lot of the people who have a stake in this, they feel like they didn't get that outreach in advance. And so the sort of, maybe more frank comments that would have happened behind closed doors before this bill was introduced are now getting aired quite publicly.
Wow. Yeah. And it looks like there's a vote coming up on March 18th, and we'll see where that goes. But I did want to bring up a point that Nelson and maybe one of her allies on this plan, if you want to call it that, Councilmember Rivera, were bringing up. There was this environmental impact statement from 2022 that showed up to 990 industry-supportive housing units would be compatible with the port. That's what the EIS said. But those units never ended up in this plan. Rather, there was a compromise with hotels, retail stores, bars, restaurants, offices. David, I heard Nelson and Rivera really try to hammer on that EIS. Do you think they were able to make a case? Is that going to be cogent in this conversation?
I think the case that they're making is to sort of the broader audience. They're not going to convince the people who are sitting at the table. The port has said that though they didn't challenge that conclusion at the time, if they had known basically that this proposal would come back, that they would have challenged it. They fundamentally disagree with the conclusions of that EIS. And, there seems to be some agreement from, Councilmember Kettle, for example, seemed to kind of sympathize with that argument that the conclusions that it wouldn't have much impact were not right. But, at the end of the day, the port had the opportunity to challenge those conclusions and they didn't do it. And so I think for backers of this proposal, sort of reminding people over and over that there is this pretty extensive study that says these units wouldn't cause a big traffic impact. And I think that even more kind of salient point that Councilmember Rivera kept bringing up was, hey, why are you guys okay with hotels here, but you're not okay with housing? Because probably some valet service or a lot of people staying and coming and going. I think for the port, the kind of underappreciated concern here is almost one of gentrification in a way, if that's the right word, which is they believe that if you put people there and people that live there permanently, as opposed to people who are there temporarily, those people are going to be more likely to complain to their council person, complain to the mayor about the noisy trucks and the things sort of.
And we don't have grocery stores down here, all sorts of things.
Yeah, exactly. And so that will sort of create this pressure to build up that area or, silence the trucks. Whereas, I think they see hotel guests, maybe they would complain to the front desk, but they're not going to complain to elected officials about this. And so I think it's in some ways this kind of slippery slope argument, which this housing for the port represents a foothold in that area that could then grow into something bigger. The proponents of putting housing there say that's all hypothetical, that's all very theoretical. Our own studies say it's not going to be an impact, and we need housing.
Yeah, they're really trying to protect industrial lands. I heard that a number of times. Just to come back to this plan is scheduled for a vote on March 18th, and there's been a lot of infighting on the council with this. You mentioned this too. You posted about this dynamic between Council President Nelson and Council Member Strauss in particular is kind of uncomfortable. What do you mean by that? I know I've seen it too, but what are you seeing, and what does that say to you?
I think Council Member Strauss, he put a lot of time and energy into that 2022 or 2023 agreement.
Right, as land use chair. Right.
Yeah, as land use chair. He's not the land use chair anymore, but put a lot of work into that agreement. I think feels like, and then he feels like Council President Nelson brought this bill without giving him much warning. He said he learned about it when it showed up on the introduction and referral calendar.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, Council President Nelson, anyone who has watched her or worked with her knows she's, I don't want to use the word stubborn because that has a negative connotation, but is when she gets an idea in her head, really
sticks with it,
convinced by that idea and pushes that very hard. And so you have this sort of uncomfortable dynamic between the two where it's kind of unstoppable force versus immovable object kind of situation. And yet they both sort of try and put on this veneer of politeness. It's a very thin veneer. For me, it's fairly clear that
Let me interrupt you to say they interrupt each other quite a bit. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. They interrupt each other. Council President Nelson several times told Councilmember Strauss to not interrupt her. Councilmember Strauss likes to bring out sort of decorum questions and talk about time limits and how long each person is allowed to talk for. And there's intense allegiance to fairness. If you talk this much, I get to talk this much.
Yeah.
It is not perhaps the knockdown fights of Councilmember Sawant when she was on the council, but in some ways is more uncomfortable because they are just not saying what they actually mean publicly. They're both angry and don't particularly like each other at this moment.
Yeah, very, very, very chippy. Well, we'll see what happens with that vote coming up in March, and we'll keep abreast of any developments there and let you know about it. In other news, Victor Steinbrook Park, shut down 5.5 years ago for a complete overhaul, looks like it's ready to reopen. But then when that happens is anybody's guess. This is a battle over the totem poles that used to grace this park. David, you wrote about this in the Times. What's going on?
Yeah, this is a very Seattle story. The fight over these totem poles goes back to probably 2018. There was some question about whether or not they should be replaced with something that is maybe more reflective of the kinds of art that local tribes use rather than totem poles, these kind of more welcome poles. The Historic Commission takes this job of preserving the appearance of the park and its surroundings very seriously, and so they pushed back on replacing it. And so when it came time to renovate Victor Steinbrook Park, they were paranoid that that was going to be used as a pretext to remove these poles. So they wrote in this document, you cannot open this park without returning these poles. 5.5 years later, the park is finished. It's been finished for months now, except for these poles. And so there is a fight over, first it was a fight over whether they should be returned at all. And the second is they need restoration work. So whose job is it to restore these poles? How will they be done? Does that constitute just maintenance, or is it an actual change to the poles themselves? And so the Parks Department and the Historical Commission and the mayor's office at this point have kind of gotten into this back and forth. And the result is the commission is refusing to reopen the park until there's some legally binding document saying how and when the poles will be returned. The mayor's office, meanwhile, is looking at this park and seeing it as being sort of a thorn in its broader effort to reopen the waterfront, reopen Pike Place Market, and get ready for the World Cup and all things like that. And so it's this sort of intergovernmental, quasi-judicial fight over totem poles, and the result is tourists and people like you and me can't right now go sit at what is a nicely finished park near Pike Place Market.
Yeah, they're asking some of the different businesses, that looks really cool. Can I go in there? And it's like, no, you can't. It's really interesting. And that whole idea, I wanted to jump back on that idea of what's authentic here. So the Historic Commission is saying, no, we need to replace, we need to preserve these poles and have them in there as they were. But then in 2018, you brought this up, there were some prominent Native American critics in our area, like Colleen Echohawk, former council member Deborah Juarez, who said these don't really represent local Native art forms. That whole question of authenticity, I know that goes into a lot of historic preservation, but how do you look at that issue of authenticity, David?
Yeah, it's challenging because it sort of depends on how far back you want to look. You know what I mean? Because the argument of the people like Echohawk and Juarez, who have backed off of their stances, but their argument at the time was, if we want to greet people with authentic Puget Sound area art, totem poles are sort of reductionist. They don't actually reflect the complexity of that. And so that is sort of that's got a long look back in its history about what really represents native local tribes. Whereas the commission's sense of history goes back not as far. They are looking back. Their job is to be protectors of the market. That goes back to the 70s when they were established as part of the kind of Save the Market campaign that Victor Steinbrook was responsible for. And so for them, they look back to 1984, really, when these poles were erected, and say, hey, they have become a iconic piece of the park, and our job is to protect the character of the park. Ergo, the poles need to return. And so whenever you get into these fights over authenticity, it touches on some nerves. And then, there's more nuance to it than that, too. There are other Native voices who say, hey, these poles are actually a great reflection of local customs. There was a lot of trading that happened. The Marvin Oliver, the person who designed the poles, is a member of the Quinault tribe. So, it gets really thorny. Again, though, I think for the average tourist or person in Seattle who just wants to go and buy a humbao or whatever and go sit in the park and eat it, some of that nuance is lost, and it can be kind of frustrating.
Yeah, Seattle, out of my humbao. I can see the protest now. Thank you for that, David. All right, well, up next, for the first time, the city is hearing at length from its new police chief, Sean Barnes. What are we learning about his priorities as he comes into this position? We're going to break it down. Coming up on Now Hear This. The Seattle City Council heard from the city's new police chief, Sean Barnes, this week. Barnes still has the interim title until he's officially confirmed by the council. But interim Chief Barnes has been working, charting a future for the department that focuses on crime prevention, community outreach, and a plan for officer recruitment and retention that brought out a reflective moment in his address to the council.
You don't attract what you want, you attract who you are. And if you don't show that you are a place that's inviting and welcoming to people, people will not want to apply. And so we're working on that with our materials, and I'm certainly thankful for the men and women who work in our recruiting section.
David, I thought the chief's presentation covered some ground all of us have heard about before, from officer recruitment to the importance of collaborating with the council and other city departments. But maybe I was just looking at the PhD at the end of the chief's title. Here's a guy who has served as a professor of criminal justice at one point in his career. I just found that what came across to me in that presentation was a very strong academic voice from the chief there. One really focused on some current trends, but some past lessons too. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I agree. I think he's coming at this from a sort of heady standpoint. How that translates into... How that translates into running a department will be interesting to see. It's a really challenging job because you were caught. I think in some ways, I think it's the most challenging job in the city, actually, because you are sort of balancing more competing voices than probably any other job, because you have to lead the department, which has its own culture. You have to report. You're working at the behest of the mayor, so you've got to, it's sort of political in a way. You've got to answer to the Seattle City Council. Those things combined make it a really sort of uncomfortable position to be in, and I think there's a reason why we've seen so much turnover, not always gracefully in that job. And so, I think maybe being academic about it is perhaps as good of approach as any, because I think it requires a level of intentionality and thoughtfulness to do that job well and to hold that job. And so, I don't know how it'll work out for him, but I think it's interesting that he's coming in from such an academic perspective, as you mentioned.
And dealing with the Seattle Police Officers Guild, the police union, that's another political dimension to this as well. I did want to talk about one thing the chief identified in his speech, one challenge here about the 30 by 30 report, which aims to have women make up 30% of SPD's workforce by the year 2030. Chief Barnes pointed out that the group that authored this report has been defunded by the Trump administration, which Barnes quickly pointed out would not impact Seattle's dedication to this ideal. And I heard the chief say also, David, that diverse groups outperform non-diverse groups when they're managed properly. But I just wonder about this. I know he's got some local support, but there's some national pressure over these issues. Is that going to affect him? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't know that the federal government has to do anything to make it hard for the Seattle Police Department to achieve this goal. They were already falling short on their own, regardless of what the federal government was doing. Much has been made of the fact that the Seattle Police Department finally added an officer last year rather than losing officers.
Right.
You look at who was hired; it was about 15% women, not 30%.
Yep.
I think in a lot of ways that is a stated goal, the 30 by 30, one that people say is important to them. But at the end of the day, I think what is probably trumps that is hiring more officers. I think that is the reason that a lot of people in City Hall were elected, is to bring on more officers. And while I think people say they want that 30 by 30 goal, I think probably what they really want is to hire more officers. And so it seems like in order to make that 30 by 30 goal a reality would take some real intentionality to make it happen. But I think the focus right now is just frankly on numbers rather than who exactly is coming through the door.
I hear you loud and clear on that one. I wanted to switch gears with you and talk about some interesting notes from the Housing and Human Services Committee this week. They're looking at the city's approach on outreach to people who are unsheltered. As you might know, the city took over this task from the King County Regional Homelessness Authority last year. Here in 2025, we're going to see a deployment of a city district-based model. So this means the Unified Care Team, that overall city team, will be working with other organizations like We Deliver Care, the Salvation Army, for example, on a district-by-district basis. So the teams will have street-based care for people in encampments, a vehicle outreach group for people living in cars, and behavioral and mental health specialists as well. On a citywide level, they will have a population-specific outreach, the Seattle Indian Center, for example, to connect with different population groups like Native Americans or families actually out on the streets as well. David, I was looking at this. It seemed like a relatively solid structure, but I just was wondering if doing this on the district by district level will result in competition between districts for resources, or what do you see coming out of this approach?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think that's a perennial question around the district system.
Yeah, that model.
And I do think there are indications that it has sort of encouraged some siloing and some competition between council members.
I've been using the word balkanization a lot because I just love that word. Yes,
that's a great word. Yes, I agree. but at the same time, I think when it comes to homelessness and outreach, if you talk to folks who have been doing it a lot, specificity is good generally. People say one size doesn't fit all the time. Yeah. It's cliche, but I think being able to kind of focus on individual populations at a sort of micro level tends to lead to better results.
Yeah.
I don't know if that translates to geography exactly.
Right.
Where those people are, but maybe it encourages more kind of focus on that specificity of who's being served. I don't know the answer to that. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I think it was definitely a deliberative move to say, hey, we are reaching out to all parts of the city, because all parts of the city do have some homelessness issues going on for sure. There was another part of this presentation I thought was interesting too. It indicated that there will be some performance metrics in place for quantity, how many people these teams are reaching, quality, the type of interaction these teams have with people who are unhoused, and then impact, meaning how many encampments were cleaned up, how many people enrolled in outreach services or housing programs or treatment plans. And that's the part that I always pause with, because from what I've seen over the past decade plus, even the most effective groups out there doing this work don't always have a good batting average, let's call it, when doing this work. What do you think this group has to show show the city, I guess I would say, to be deemed a success? How do you look at that?
Yeah, and it's, when you hear this from providers, especially like Lead or We Deliver Care.
Yeah.
This feels true, but also I could see how some people might see it as an excuse. But when you're asking, when you are sort of trying to measure success by number of people who go from A to B and successfully stay there, and that's good on the one hand. On the other hand, it can encourage organizations to go after the low-hanging fruit, because when you are asking organizations to work with the city's most difficult population, people who have intense mental illness, drug addiction, have been homeless for years and years and years, those numbers are not going to look particularly good, because they're blunt about how difficult it is and how long it takes to work with those people to get them stabilized. And so I think, We Deliver Care and those folks would be the first to say maybe their numbers don't look particularly good, but that's a reflection of the population they work with. And if we get too hung up on those, then you have these situations where the people who maybe have just fallen into homelessness and just need a paycheck to get back, they might focus on those, and then your numbers look really good, but you haven't really solved the essential problem of, which I think is what most of people who live in Seattle want solved, which is the people who you see every day in, day out on 3rd Avenue, 12th and Jackson, who are having a really hard time, really struggling. There's no silver bullet for those folks. They need time and energy, and so your numbers aren't always going to look particularly good on their surface. Yeah,
it's a very small percentage overall of the population of homeless people in our area, but definitely some of the most visible, and in many ways contributing to a lot of the different street disorder that Seattle is seeing. All right, well, coming up, a housing issue of a different kind, talking about the Multifamily Tax Exemption Program, the MFTE. How's it been working over the past decade? The answer might surprise you. We'll discuss that coming up on What's Next. David, I wanted to jump into this multifamily tax exemption story with you. The Housing and Human Services Committee is discussing it this week, and the council is talking about extending this benefit. So the UW and the city's Office of Housing worked on a report to see, is this MFTE program working? So this is where the city gives developers of these multifamily buildings a tax break in exchange for affordable housing units provided for people with restricted income, for example. MFTE has been in Seattle in some shape or form since 1998. It's gone through many permutations since then. The bottom line, David, I'm seeing from this report is that it's worked maybe, meaning more than 300 developments have been built with help from the MFTE for a total of 34,000 housing units, which sounds great. But the authors of this report are not sure if that's because of the tax break or if that type of building would have happened without MFTE, just because there's been such a demand for housing in our region. And most of these units that have been built through this program are one bedroom. So what larger impact are they really having? I guess I wanted to lay this big question out there, David. Is MFTE, which costs the city about $35 million per year, is it worth it for the city of Seattle?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not one I have a great answer for. I think it. I haven't heard any. I haven't heard like a lot of strong opposition exactly to MFT, but similar to that, I've seen some question mark about whether or not if the incentive is enough to developers to really go after it.
Yep.
I think there's also some questions too about the ongoing upkeep of MFTE and whether developers, if say a developer builds a building and they have an MFTE quote apartment in there.
Yeah.
I think there's some question about, maybe that's the basement apartment. They turn the worst unit in the building into the quote MFTE building or MFTE apartment.
Yeah.
Are they sort of giving those units as much attention and love as they would to their other ones?
Sure.
I think there's been some question marks around that.
Yeah.
So, I don't have a great answer for it. And then, it seems like there has been in this ongoing discussion about its renewal, more conversation around to whom these should be affordable to. I think the Seattle City Council wants to lower the limit a little bit. So
in terms of like area median income or whatever else.
Yeah, I think it was maybe 60% or something like that,
right.
and they want to bring it down to something like 50%. So that opens up some questions around: are you going to have to evict people who are making 60%?
Right.
A lot of questions about this program. I think the ambiguity is enough that I would be surprised if anyone's ready to kill it or anything like that. There's, like you said, the numbers look okay. It's sort of hard to compare it against the absence of this.
Yes. The authors of the report said the same thing. Right.
So I'm sure it'll continue on, but at the same time, I've never heard anybody argue that MFT is the path to affordability for families in Seattle.
No, I think it's one. Yeah, it's one of many tools that the city's using. Jumping back real quick on that developer's question, there was a developer that was actually quoted in this report who said the city and the development community would be better served if the city set goals and said, okay, this program is going to be for 3 years. We want this amount of production, and if we're not getting that, then we'll adjust, especially when developers are going through economic downturns like COVID, for example. It's one of these deals where I always come back to this. If these projects don't pencil out, then developers are not going to do them, and then the city's not going to get the units that it wants, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's always the question around affordability requirements is, are you shooting yourself in the foot in a way, because by layering on those requirements too much, do you make it so that housing doesn't get built at all? And, I think even housing for very rich people, I think a lot of sort of academics would say that does help ease the supply and demand question, even if it is going towards people making more money. So if you are discouraging those buildings from being built, you are actually exacerbating the issue. Again, it's hard. This comes up with MHA sometimes, is how many more buildings would have been built without MHA?
Yeah, mandatory housing affordability. Yeah,
we just don't have that. We don't live in that timeline anymore, and so it sort of leaves open this question for people to choose whichever side they believe in, and not budge from it.
Yeah, interesting question. A number of them that the council is wrestling with right now as it looks through this multifamily tax exemption program here. And I'll keep you posted if something new and different comes along. But I'm with you, David. I'm pretty sure the council is going to pass this along. All right, it is time to wrap up. I wanted to jump back to baseball with you. I noticed this week in baseball history, probably the greatest email I get every week, and I open it with alacrity there. In 1894, there was a major rule change this week. All foul bunts from there on out were finally called strikes. Do we need to reverse this? Do we need to go back to 12-hour games? I just wanted to throw that out there, David. What do you think?
That's funny. I never given that rule much thought. I think it's good. It's sort of, if you really are committed to the bunt, then you got to put yourself on the line for it. And anything to discourage sacrifice bunting, I'm okay with. So.
Oh man, you don't like sacrifice bunts? Come on, it's the game within the game.
I like bunts for base hits. I don't like sacrifice bunts.
Okay.
Seems just like a bad trade, and out for a sacrifice doesn't make sense to me.
David's digging on the long ball. I like it. I like it. But we'll have a whole nother discussion about home runs later on. But David, thank you so much for joining me as always. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show. If you're not a patron, get on it. Support the show for just $5 a month on Patreon. Would be greatly appreciated. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.